Welcome to our Nova Scribes meetup on DEI basics for facilitators. And so we are here with Suman Kapur, one of my new facilitator friends. And this is gonna be a Q&A with Suman on DEI basics. But first, a few announcements. Who am I? I am Lauren Green. I'm one of the Nova Scribes organizers. My company is Dancing with Markers. We have a Facebook group. You can check us out online. We do graphic recording, we do facilitation, and I am really pleased to be hosting this session. This is a topic that came up as a need in one of my former Friday coffee chats, and so we wanted to bring it to the Nova Scribes group. First off, if this is your first Nova Scribes meetup ever, go ahead and raise a virtual thumb or a thumbs up in chat or a thumbs up in your camera. Excellent. So I'm going to break from the normal way we typically do what is Nova Scribes. And if you're a Nova Scribes veteran, I want you to drop into chat one thing that you love about Nova Scribes meetup and drop that into chat. And so that way you can see the people. Yes, we are a welcoming community. We are facilitators. We are scribes. We are tech hosts. We are coaches. We are leaders. We are project managers. We are anyone who uses visuals in our practice in service of others. Great energy, welcomeness. So if you are a facilitator and you use flip charts, you are a visual practitioner. Welcome. We are so glad that you're here. And we hope to see you at future Nova Scribes events. I know on the meetup right now, and I'll drop the link in chat, there is another event advertising the IFVP in Spain, which is also online. So you can check that out. IFVP is International Forum of Visual Practitioners. It is definitely a bucket list conference to do at some point. So definitely check it out. And stay tuned on the website. There's always new events popping up. But that's what's going on with Nova Scribes. So thank you so much for being here. So today so DEI basics for facilitators. The outcomes for today are to really answer the question, how can we create inclusive facilitation? Okay. You are not going to leave this workshop knowing how to lead a DEI workshop. It's not what this is about. You are going to leave today understanding basics of creating inclusion so that you as a facilitator, coach, leader, don't take missteps when it comes to some key inclusive principles. This is a safe space, so we welcome your questions. We are going to be using Mentimeter for questions. So please don't put questions in the chat. Please don't put questions in the chat. I'm not going to look at questions in the chat unless someone really can't get into Menti. It's too hard to follow. Use the link I just popped into the Zoom chat. I will keep posting this over and over again. So if you miss it, don't worry. Questions in the menti.com. Feel free to use the chatter away. But we're going to use Menti for questions. So again, we really want basic level what's important as a facilitator. A few housekeeping things. For the scribes out there, we hope that you grabbed your iPad or your notebook, or maybe some of you have flip chart and markers. Please take visual notes and please share them. This is an ideal opportunity to practice taking visual notes. And I'm going to slow way down and give you time to write that title on your page. DEI Basics for Facilitators with Suman Kapur, Suman Kapur is our speaker, hosted by Nova Scribes. The date is June 21st, 2022. So please take your visual notes, please share them. We would love to see. We are swimming without a lifeguard. What does that mean? We don't have a designated tech host, although I know Rachel Thompson is in the room and she's an amazing tech host. What that means is please chat to all. If you're having any technical difficulties, chat to everybody. Someone will help you out and we'll help each other out. Be respectful. We all come from different types of intersectionality. So it's very important that we respect all questions in this group and the way that they ask them, even if it's not technically accurate. So knowing that everyone's got a different level of understanding, myself included, be respectful, be open, and I will be the first one to say, please correct me if at any point I take a misstep myself, because this is also a wonderful learning experience for me. Questions, please feel free in the moment. If you have a clarifying question, raise a virtual hand and we'll get it. Otherwise, all of the questions, if you wouldn't mind, should please go into the Menti link. Pop that link in chat once again, so you can submit questions that way. But if Suman says something that just in the moment you go, oh wait, I didn't catch that, I want to make sure it's clear, go ahead and either interrupt or raise a virtual hand and we'll answer clarifying questions in the moment. So with that, let's jump right in. I'd love to introduce our speaker, Suman Kapur, who I met through my lovely friend, Gina Weatherup. And Suman is the CEO of Well Balanced Solutions. Suman is a professional development consultant dedicated to supporting individuals and organizations through conflict management and culture change initiatives. And she's just a lovely person. Her focus is on the values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. DEIB, we're going to talk about acronyms too, so get ready. And I would love to give Suman a chance to introduce herself, tell us a little bit more about her practice and what she's looking forward to today. While she's doing that, go ahead and drop your own introduction into chat. What is your location, your preferred pronouns, and what does diversity mean to you? So you throw in chat your location, your preferred pronouns, what is diversity to you? And I'd love to have Suman come on, tell us a little bit more about what you're looking forward to today.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation. Lauren did a great job sort of summarizing the work that I do. I've been doing this DEI conflict management consulting for about 1.5 years now. It all stemmed out of the work I've done historically, but really from the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago. And that really kind of put me into this space. Wish I wasn't in it, wish we didn't need it, but here I am. And so I love the work I do. I work with organizations who are really dedicated to understanding how to create a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and really create a sense of belonging for their employees. We know just statistically and from talking to people want to belong. They want to have a sense of community. And by creating that in the work environment, they will increase engagement. And so that's my goal, is to help organizations really create that safe space for people to come and show up and do the work, but also to be valued. And I live in the DC area, married to my college sweetheart. And we just celebrated 20 years, though I tease him and say, we've really been together 32 years. So I need to get the 32-year gifts rather than the 20-year gifts. I have a rising senior who's my son. So we're in the midst of college searching. And I have a rising 7th grader daughter, is a competitive gymnast. Both my kids are athletes, and they are really the driving force of why I do the work that I do. As a woman of color, really trying to create an inclusive environment where my kids and the next generation can really come together and show up as who they are. And I know that's a term we use a lot in this work, but it's an important term, to come as your whole self. So that's what I'm here to talk about a little bit today. And I always like to start with a definition so that we're all sort of on a same playing field. So I know Lauren asked if people would drop diversity, what they believe diversity is. And I'm seeing a few things in here, and I'm loving everything that's listed here. So when I ask people in my presentations to define diversity, typically I get it, the response is around diversity is race, religion, and sexual orientation. The reality is there's so much more to the term diversity. And we really need to understand that diversity is this very big range of human differences that include, but again, not limited to race, ethnicity, gender identity. You have sexual orientation, social class, physical ability or attributes. Then you add religious or ethical value systems, national origin, political beliefs, and even personality styles create diversity. And so when you're thinking about this work, there's so much to it. And I also want to share what diversity equity, inclusion, and belonging means, right? So definitions are so important so we get an understanding of what's happening. And I'm wondering if people have heard of, there is an image out there, a very popular image and analogy around dance, right? So diversity is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. The equity is how much floor space you get. So just because you're a petite woman doesn't mean that you should get a sliver of that dance floor. And then belonging is who gets to choose the music. And if you have a diverse group of people attending the dance, then all kinds of music is going to be playing. So that is sort of, and I love this visual because it really does give a sense of what the meaning of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging is. And so with that, I'm just trying to see and hear what other questions or comments we have in here before we jump off into the next section.
I believe that, and I did summarize that dance metaphor in chat. And if you're taking visual notes, would love to see some dance included in your notes. I love that metaphor. So far in the chat, people have been introducing themselves, giving their pronouns, and defining diversity. So I think we're okay to move to the first question. How does that sound?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, so this first question is actually for you all, for the group, and we're going to try to integrate some interactive questions in here. So answer this one in chat. What acronyms have you heard of when it comes to diversity and inclusion? You can pop those in the chat. What acronyms have you heard of? I think Evelyn just got them all. Nice. BIPOC,
Oh,
DEI,
yeah.
DEI, JEDI. Yep. Excellent. REI,
These are great.
This is great. So Suman, the question for you is, oh my gosh, alphabet soup. Is there a right way? Is there a right order? Tell us more.
Yes. And so, there is, and if you don't know, the one that I really do want to point out here is BIPOC. And I'm glad someone put that in there. So BIPOC is, and the way I put it out there, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color. So, when it was first put out there, people were so confused. They were saying Black, Indigenous, people of color, lumping it into as one type of representation, but it's not. So a bunch of commas in there. And so, as the DEI alphabet soup started not only as a marketing tactic, but some providers will actually organize the letters in order of their importance. So for example, some will say you have to have equity before you can have diversity or inclusion. So they might say, JEDI, or you have to have justice first. That's how that JEDI came in: justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. Others say, it's social justice has to come first. Then they've added SJ to their groups. And when the various acronyms started coming out, I really started to see the conversation, this DEI conversation around acronyms taking the forefront of conversations. And there was all this chatter back and forth about the order of acronyms. And people were losing sight of the work that needed to be done because these acronyms were taking the forefront of conversation. Does the J come first? You need diversity first, or equity, or inclusion, and everything else that comes with it. So personally, for me, it's not important how you organize these letters if you're not doing the work. The order of the letters seems to be getting so much more conversation than the meaning of the work behind them. So for me, DEIB rolls off clearly for me. That doesn't mean one is more important than the other, as long as that work behind equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is getting done.
And just wanted to address comment in chat. I'm really curious what your thoughts are in this related to acronyms. The analogy of DEI itself can come off as ableist. So noticing that doesn't have the A, often used for accessibility. So would just love your thoughts on, I guess for the analogy of dance. So I guess that's sort of feedback on the dance analogy, is that it might not be an inclusive of the A, which is really, really dynamite feedback, but just curious if you have thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. We talk about intersectionality and the lens in which we do this work. In my mind, I have had people who are neurodiverse, physically diverse. And so when I use the word and even the definition of diversity, for me, that's already included in there. So again, but I appreciate that call out because now I will go back and think about how I present that analogy. But again, that's my intersectionality and the lens in which I was bringing. And I truly appreciate that point out.
Yes, yeah, really, really, really ideal. So thank you for that feedback in chat. So another question for the group, yes or no question in chat. Does DEI, or I'll say DEIB to use Suman's term, does DEIB come into your role as a facilitator or a scribe? Does DEIB come into your role as a facilitator or a scribe? And got lots of yeses.
Oh, yes, I love that.
This is not a trick question.
No,
really.
it is not.
But it's good to acknowledge. It's good to acknowledge. And so, so for Suman, you really are a DEIB expert. You've studied this. You're teaching it. You've taken the time to hone your skills. And like you said, the journey is never done. So I would love to hear a little bit more from you. How do you distinguish your skills as an expert in DEIB from that of someone who calls themselves a facilitator? Just using that term. How do you distinguish those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while I do implement the same skills that we learn as a facilitator, when it comes to doing the DEIB work, there needs to be a lot more than just empathy when it comes to facilitating DEIB conversations, right? So the facilitator should have some relatable experience to what's happening within that marginalized community that they're facilitating, right? While there's no steadfast rule for this, just imagine optics, right? I'm a big fan of imagining optics. Imagine the optics of facilitating a DEI conversation with either a mixed crowd or predominantly BIPOC community, say around race or sexual orientation, but it's being led by a white cisgender person, right? So now just visualize that power dynamic behind that image, right? So while a facilitator is taught to be as neutral as possible, the audience is not taught to be neutral, right? The audience is bringing in the emotion. So the optics, the perceived power dynamics of someone who has no visual, relatable experience to that marginalized group will exist, and that facilitator can lose credibility, right? So now you might be thinking, but I've seen or I've heard white cisgender people leading DEI initiatives within an organization. Or you may even be asking, can a white cisgender person lead DEI conversations, right? And so to that I say, we know that people listen to others who look like them and or who have similar experience as each other. So if an audience is predominantly white and the facilitator has done significant DEI learning, then that facilitator can actually be an ally to these conversations, right? So as an ally, a white DEI facilitator is important and needed, especially when the audience is predominantly white or predominantly has that same background as that facilitator. And the facilitator really can shed light on this difficult subject and really start to open up conversations, which some people call them difficult conversations. I call them courageous conversations. These DEI conversations are it takes courage and to be brave to have these conversations. So there's no direct answer to that question, except it's very much about optics.
Thank you, Suman. And I think being aware of the optics is really critical. And I've I've myself have a listening workshop. And that listening workshop does dig into mental models, and I have to be aware of It's not a bias workshops, it's not a bias training. And depending on the group, I might not be the right person to lead a training on unconscious bias. I just wanted to clarify a couple of terms that you used in case they are new for the group. The first one is cisgender, which might actually be new for a couple of people. I know I've heard of heteronormative, but maybe you could just clarify some of these terms and what's appropriate.
Yeah, so cisgender, by definition, is a person, whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex, right? So I consider myself cisgender. I was born female and identify as female. So that's the term for that's the definition for cisgender.
And is that the same as heteronormative, or is that a little bit different?
So it's interesting. I've not heard of the term heteronormative. So thank you for sharing that one with me. See, even as an expert, constantly learning. The field of DEI is constantly moving. And I love this conversation, not only for the conversation itself, but for this. So say that again, Lauren, please.
Oh, heteronormative. And if anybody on the call would like to define heteronormative for the group, I welcome
please.
that. Anyone want to go off mute?
Yeah, as far as I understand, cisgender is very relative to someone's identity, whereas heteronormative is more related to the worldview that promotes heterosexuality as kind of like the basis or the norm or the standard, the dominance of it being like the standard.
Let's all give snaps and virtual applause to Evelyn. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much, Evelyn, for being brave, hopping on, making sure that was clear to the group. The other term that I wanted to just quickly clarify is the term ally. And we talk about allyship, and probably everybody in here has heard the word ally, but how do you define what it means to be an ally, Suman?
Yeah, so ally, in the simplest definition, is using your privilege to support the marginalized community. That's as simple as I can make it. So even though I'm a woman of color, I do hold some sense of privilege based on my education, where I live, a variety of different intersectionalities that do give me some level of privilege. And therefore I can be, and I am an ally to other communities, and specifically to other people who are marginalized, who may not have the level of privilege that I have, even though I'm a person of color.
The other thing that I want to point out is that Suman actually did a really lovely job of demoing something that we as facilitators should all keep in our pockets when we reach something that we're maybe not as familiar with. And many of you probably caught it, but she was really honest and transparent. I don't know that term. And then inviting somebody in the group who might be more knowledgeable to share about that, and then taking an action to write it down and say, I'm going to learn more about that. That was a really vulnerable moment. And thank you for being open and showing us that is something that we can always do. It's never comfortable to say, I don't know. And this is absolutely an area that saying, I don't know when you don't know is really, really important.
Absolutely. Thank you for calling that out. You know, in the work that we do, I really feel if leaders were more vulnerable, we would have less conflict and less challenges that we have in the workplace. Like I said, this learning is ongoing. My journey doesn't end because someone calls me an expert. I don't like that term, because an expert means I know it all, and I don't know it all. Constantly learning, constantly tweaking what I have learned. I'm doing what I can until I know better, and then I know better. I'm doing better. John Lewis, that's the work we have to do. We have to make sure that we are constantly learning, and there are parts of this DEIB conversation that is constantly changing until we learn and learn again and learn better. So thank you for calling that out. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So going to continue to mosey on through our questions. Again, if you have any questions for Suman, you can pop those into Menti. If you want anything clarified immediately about anything that's said, raise that virtual hand, and we will do that. Just pop the Menti link in chat again. So this kind of relates the conversation we're having now to the next question, which is how should facilitators handle comments about race that come up out of the blue? All of a sudden, it's in your space. And as a facilitator, what do you do in that moment?
Yep. Thank you. So remember, this conversation today is really surface level. So we can dive a lot deeper into this, but I just wanted to share, it's so important to acknowledge, right, that the conversation has come up. Even though it's off the agenda, even though it may not be planned, it's important to acknowledge it. Simple, that's a great point, or this is a really important conversation for us to have. And then show some level of vulnerability, similar to, like Lauren pointed out. You could say something like, I welcome the conversation, but I realize I'm not the expert, or I'm not the right person to guide that conversation, right? So you're acknowledging it. You might say, I don't know, I'm not the right person for this, and then refocus. Say, listen, at this moment, because we have the agenda, we should move forward, but I'm remembering that I'm going to come back to this, right? So you're constantly acknowledging that this question, this part of the conversation is there. You're not leaving it, you're not brushing it aside. You're trying to refocus the conversation back to that agenda. And again, if you don't have that expertise, let the audience know that you're going to connect with the sponsor and we're going to try to get the right facilitator in for that conversation. And then follow through. Let them know, I'm planning to get back to you. I'll be sure to get back to you in 2 days, a week, whatever it is, whatever amount of time it's going to take for you to figure out what that next step is. And so it's really important to keep coming back to and not just tossing it under the carpet and to ignore it. So in your wrap up of the facilitation, you can always go back and say, I remember that we do have this conversation around race, or whatever the topic is. It came up. I haven't forgotten it. I have my note. I'll be back in touch with the group 48 hours, a week from now, after I've talked to a sponsor, after I figured out what those next steps are going to look like. But again, don't brush it under, and try not to, if you don't have a comfort level with it, don't go deeper and deeper into the conversation. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to get yourself out of it without creating a more emotional situation.
One of the Nova Scribes organizers and one of my best friends, Brian Turallo, Dynamite facilitator, always says, never lead a group somewhere you can't lead them back from. And that's really important. So the strategy that Suman is suggesting, it's not the only strategy that you can take. If you are comfortable going there and you feel equipped, you can go deeper. And in a lot of cases, if it's not the topic or goal of the meeting, the strategy that she's suggesting of acknowledging, reminding the group of the meeting goals, and recognizing that in that moment, maybe you're not the right person, but following through on making sure that that conversation can get set up if it needs to happen. That is a strategy that most people would feel comfortable using so that they don't completely lose the group. And again, if it's a different situation if your meeting is on that. So this is it comes up out of the blue and now it needs to be addressed. Yeah, go ahead, Suman.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask if anyone in the group has ever experienced that. If you were facilitating a conversation around subject A and something came up around race or this diversity conversation, has anyone ever experienced it? And if so, if you're willing to come off of mute and share, we'd love to hear it, and just to, again, to gain some insight as to how you manage the conversation, or you can drop it in the chat and I'd be happy to read it out, however if people are comfortable.
And I did see, Christine, you put, yep. If you would be comfortable sharing a micro version of your story, changing names as needed, we'd love to hear it. And if not, no worries.
No, I'm sure a lot of folks have dealt with this, but the instance that I immediately came to mind for me, we were doing a facilitated discussion on leadership and community. It was a diverse group of folks in the room. And at one point, one of the women of color in the group was sharing her lived experience and why she felt that her leadership and community was not necessarily received the same way that other folks' leadership and community was. And one of the cisgendered dominant culture women in the room proceeded to just say, well, I just think it's your problem because like I don't see color. And immediately like the room exploded. For anybody, you're all laughing, so you know what that means. But she felt that the woman, the dominant culture woman, felt it very authentically, that she felt that because she did not see color, she was that made her a good community leader. And so the way that we handled it was we kind of paused for a minute, took a deep breath, and then asked the woman of color who was speaking, because it was kind of her floor time, one, whether or not she wanted to continue with the dialogue and engage in the conversation. Fortunately, she was also a very skilled community engagement person, and she just responded with, let me tell you how that lands when you say that out loud. And she kind of highlighted it. Of course, then, unfortunately, the dominant culture woman ended up crying in front of everybody, and it got very uncomfortable. But we worked our way through it. But it can be, I think, as Suman and Lauren said, a very risky and very vulnerable set of circumstances to have to facilitate your way through.
Well done. Not only for sharing that in the group, but also it sounds like the way that you handled it and being prepared, or at least prepared enough to understand some of the basics. Suman, any thoughts for Christine?
No, I appreciate, Christine, that you shared that with us. You saw people's reactions to that "don't see color" statement, which, decades ago, that was an acceptable phrase people used to say, I don't see you as Asian or Black or Hispanic, I see you as a person. And again, we're learning better, because what that statement takes away from is your experience, your lived experience, your intersectionality when someone says, I don't see color. And so I appreciate the fact that the group that Christine was talking about gave the woman the opportunity to share her experience about how she felt. I would be curious, and I don't know if there is time for this, but when the woman started to cry, what was the reaction? How did the conversation get back on track? Because I think that's very important in this facilitation role. How does the conversation get back to that? Christine, if you're able and willing to share.
Just very briefly, I would argue that it got back to it because the woman of color kind of internalized, I think, as we all do as people of color, how far do you really want to go with this conversation? And chose grace and, I would argue, humility, where she could have been pushed it as a hard teaching moment for her. I think she felt like she said her piece, the woman heard her, and instead of trying to push it, said, I'm going to let this settle with her and let her really reflect on what I've had to say. And because this was at the end of the day, so we had done a lot of trust building kind of work leading up to that. So even though they weren't like friends, they didn't necessarily work together, I think there was a level of trust in the room that allowed it to settle with people and allowed everyone in the room, not just the woman who started crying, to really reflect on how that landed on somebody that they saw as a community leader, and process it so that we could move forward. But it was as a facilitator, I will tell you, it was probably one of the scariest things to go through, because you're trying to respect both people's needs, etc. But I think it was just that allowing the space and the quiet. I think oftentimes we try to fill the space with talking, we just let it sit and quiet and let folks just take a minute to process and really think about how it landed for them.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Again, that, you know, as a facilitator, you have your mind is set on a certain track, and then you get pushed into these different situations, especially one that's so ingrained in emotion. So kudos to you, Christine, and thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you so much. So we do have a couple of questions coming in Menti, and we have a couple of other questions that we wanted to jump in before that. Just drop the Menti link in chat so you can add more questions. And we have another question for you, our group, which is to define what inclusion means to you. What does inclusion mean to you? And to drop your definitions of inclusion into chat. And we'll just give that a minute to populate. Thanks, Evelyn. We got allies using their privilege to allow others to speak, take up space, be the expert. Kathy says to be acknowledged. Everyone feels comfortable. Everyone can be themselves without it being a thing. Making everyone feel equally welcomed and valued, giving everyone the sense that their viewpoint is valued. So keep those coming in. And just a couple more of our prepped questions for Suman. In general, what do facilitators need to know about creating inclusion?
Thanks so much. I wanted to go back and just add a couple of things to the inclusion question definition. So, you know, it's things like being treated fairly, respectfully, but also having equal access to opportunities and resources. I think that equal access is an important part of the definition when it comes to inclusion. And so now, again, very generally speaking, what do facilitators need to know about creating inclusion, right? So when we're in a group, I talked earlier, facilitators have their role. They understand what their role is. They can pull out that emotion, be neutral. The audience does not, right? The audience is coming full in. So participants tend to believe that they are inclusive, right? That's a challenge you're going to have, is that participants are going to think that they're inclusive, but the reality is that they may not be. And so think about, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this a little later on, but think about co-creating meeting agendas, making sure that the different voices are invited to participate. Be vigilant of any stereotypes or microaggressions or harm that might come up in the meetings, right? So immediately interrupt and if it's appropriate, facilitate some type of a conversation around that microaggression that might have happened, or make sure again that it's addressed in a different conversation, but don't just leave it hanging, but that immediate cutting off that microaggression or the stereotype that might be happening. And then, you know, we're seeing a lot of data that the sense of inclusion is really strongly linked with engagement. So creating that psychologically safe space for people to share and to really get involved and engage in conversations, I think is really important part for facilitators to think about when they're creating that inclusive space.
Thank you, Suman. And I'm just as you're speaking, you're giving me ideas of more questions. So
good, yes, please.
Questions in the Menti, everyone, if you have questions for Suman, and wanted to ask you, Suman, to go a little bit deeper into this area of inclusion, some key inclusive practices and tips for facilitators.
Yep, thanks so much. So I wanted to sort of look at this question from the beginning of our facilitative roles, right? So you're looking at your participants. Review that list of the attendees. Think about, are you missing anyone from a marginalized community? Those who are attending these conversations, do they represent a diverse and differing points of views, right? So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you're looking at the list of participants. And then the meeting invites go out, right? So again, let's think about it. what's the most welcoming way for you to invite participants? If it's community members are being invited, how have you ensured that any barrier like internet access, technology, anything else like that is being addressed? What about childcare needs, right? So we're trying to, again, create this inclusive meeting as a facilitator. Do the meeting dates or times conflict with religious or cultural holidays or any other important observances? And we know that there are times where you cannot change a date for a meeting. And if that's the case, acknowledge it, explain and apologize to participants if they're not able to participate. If it's a virtual meeting, consider recording it, right? So that again is overview of how you can make those meeting invitations inclusive. And if we look at the agenda for the meeting, does the structure and the method of meeting encourage inclusive participation, right? So does your agenda create thought-provoking questions? Do you have exercises in there? Are you polling? Are you mapping? Are you asking questions in an inclusive way, right? Again, inclusion includes personality styles, includes energy level, includes so much more than race, sexual orientation, and religion. So you want to make sure that your agenda and how you're approaching the day of the facilitation creates a place where everyone can be involved. Have you thought about different modes of communication? Like we talked here, you could use the chat, you can use Menti to send in Q&As, the hand raising. So really talking about different ways for people to participate. This was a new one. Someone had done this to used this in an agenda a few meetings ago. They sent out the agenda in a 14-point font. And it looked really huge when I looked at it. And I thought, oh, that's probably an inclusive tactic, right? And when I did a little bit more research, apparently there is some companies have actually written that in their charters and in their employee handbooks because it's required under certain policies to ensure accessibility, right? So that was a new one for me, always learning. And then when you're talking about the physical or virtual setup of your meeting room, right? So how accessible, how safe is the space, whether it's a physical space, whether it's online. So again, you're thinking about COVID, you're thinking about physical accessibility. If it's a virtual space, what's technology look like? And then, going to now the actual facilitation of the process of the meeting. So how will you create a space that's going to ensure that people feel welcomed, that they're listened to, that their ideas are taken seriously? And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. We did it here. We modeled and we invited participants to share their pronouns in their introduction. Think about language. So for example, use people with disabilities rather than disabled people. So you're putting people first, right? Use people first language as that default. Use people of color instead of colored people. But at the same time, respect the wishes of individuals for how they want to be referred to. So for example, my husband is Black. In the Black community, there is the question of whether you call yourself Black or African American, right? So my husband, I've had conversations with him. My husband does not feel that he is an African American because that term has so much more to it by definition. So he says he's Black American, right? So again, know the audience, understand and use the terms that they want to be called. I think the other part is remind people that there are different ways. We talked about that on how you can participate. Always co-facilitating is great if you can get a co-facilitator. And if not, just like Lauren did, swimming without a lifeguard. This is my new phrase I'm going to start borrowing from her. I love it. And then, going back to having those ground rules, we spend so much time having those community agreements that we come up with. So if, for example, someone is interrupting, remind people of those community agreements. Make sure to interrupt the interrupter, right? So you find out that research shows that women, people of color, tend to get interrupted a lot more than and are not listened to. So be aware of that as you're facilitating. Be aware of who's talking more and who's not. Find ways to involve everyone else. Sometimes, it's things like, John, we love what you're saying. We've heard from you a lot. I'd like to hear from others who might have other opinions to share. So you're not necessarily calling out the quiet people, but you're giving them that space. You're opening up that space. Even if we'd like to hear from those who haven't spoken yet, use the chat if you'd like. So those are other inclusive ways. It's really noticing those who haven't had the opportunity or might be a little nervous to speak up. And so when you're closing out your facilitation, ask questions, right? So we learn, how do you feel right now? That's such an inclusive question. Share with us what's happening. Share with us what went well in the meeting for you. What can be improved, right? So maybe we're not thinking about someone, or something has happened that we're not aware of. Even as facilitators, the experts that they're bringing in, organizations are bringing in, we still need to learn. How can we improve for the next time? What other questions? What else? You could ask them, what else do you need to be fully involved or engaged? Did you feel you didn't have the space, right? This is feedback for us to improve for our next meeting. And then, of course, thank everyone for their time, their flexibility, recognize people and the participants for being available, for doing the best given the circumstances of the conversation, for being courageous to share. And so I know this was a lot coming at you, but I really wanted to walk through the various parts that we are responsible for when we are being brought in as facilitators. And I'd love to see if there's anything else. For Lauren, what's next?
Oh, yes. So amazing list. I think that if I have one suggested homework or home joy for folks, it would be to create a list of discovery or intake questions for yourself that you can include beforehand, and start to bake that into your process with your client. Even if you can't get them all answered in that first intake, that you can sprinkle them in as you're building the relationship with the leader, whoever you're building them with. And then and just on your note about asking how you feel at the end, recognizing that inclusivity also is personality types, like introverts who might be drained by talking a lot in front of a big group. And so using some individual and small group time as well as large group time. We do have a couple of questions I want to make sure we get to in the Q&A.
Yes.
I also would love for the group, if you have meeting agreements that you really like that help promote inclusion, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and we can, then we can save that. So any meeting agreements that you liked for creating inclusion, drop those in the chat, so people can have them and take them with them. And the first question I want to ask is really related to is really important, especially for the scribes, anyone who uses visuals in their work, which is all of us. And this has to do with honoring people who might be sight impaired, and how to offer them an inclusive environment. Suman, I want to start with you, and I have a personal experience I want to share related to this. So how can we honor people with sight, who have a sight impairment, when especially we are using so many visual tools?
Yeah, and so one of the things, see, I'm still learning. I should have asked us to turn on the captions for the Zoom call, for the Zoom meeting. Constantly learning, right? So again, sitting in my privilege with my own lens, I'm not learning this. I recognize it after the fact. So I'm still learning on how to do that. But I think when it comes to these sorts of meetings, online meetings, it's such an important tool. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. Grace, right? We are learning. I had a meeting where someone did call me out on that. And unfortunately, for some reason, it didn't stick with me because Lauren, we should have talked about that one. So captions are huge. And when it comes to, so can you just clarify that question again, Lauren, you were asking me?
Sure. So how to make space for someone who is sight impaired when we use so many visual tools?
Yeah. So a lot of times companies will provide there's a name for it. It's slipping my mind right now. But there are ways for, it's not the Braille system, but there are systems out there for sight impaired, and it helps them to understand. Of course, there's when the sight goes down, you've got stronger senses on the hearing. So that also helps, right? So constantly reframing conversations. Lauren, you did a great job when I was sharing a variety of different tactics. You summarized really well what I was talking about. So having that as a facilitation skill is really important, is to take what someone has said over X number of minutes and reframe and summarize so that, again, the visually impaired has an opportunity then to hear it in a more succinct manner. And I'd love to hear, of course, if there are other conversations out there and other tactics for people to share.
And I'd love to, I love talking about a friend of mine, Tiffany, who I went to grad school with. She gave us the incredible gift. She is legally blind, and she has a service dog, and she was with us for the whole 2 years. And because she was in our program, we learned from her exactly what she needed. And we all got in the habit of sending out slides in advance, making sure that she had the content so that she could use her reader. And most of the time it was just asking her what she needed. And so grad school was when I was first starting to get into my work as a scribe. And I did a specific activity where we did a roadmap, and I sat with Tiffany and asked her what she needed. And she really said, I just need you to tell me what I'm looking at. And then she needed someone to kind of sit with her and tell her what they wanted to write. And so we just made that accommodation for her. And it was for Tiffany, at least, it was just being asked. And so that she had that space to let us know what she needed and to give her, that cue.
I love that. And, you can actually take that and add it to the meeting invite, right? Or onto the agenda. If you need accommodations, please let us know, right? And it's taken right there. You're not calling anyone out in a meeting. No one is having to raise their hand and say, oh, by the way, I need XYZ accommodations when the meeting has already started. So that's a great thing to put into that meeting invite.
Let me ask you we have a couple more in just a few minutes left. Suman did drop her LinkedIn in the chat in case you have to pop out. You can connect with her on LinkedIn. But this was one that, let's see. I love this one, and it comes up all the time in communities of practice. Do you recommend pointing out problematic terminology, assumptions, or actions made by someone in a group in real time? So do you recommend pointing it out in real time, or address it later, or something else?
Yep. So great question. And we know it happens all the time. For me, I read the room, right? So I will, for example, we had a whole conversation around what is BIPOC, what is cisgendered, right? If there are ways to call out certain things as part of the conversation, I think it's important to do it. But I also think there's a way to do it where you're not calling out an individual, right? You can say something to the effect of, someone made a comment a few minutes ago about A, B, C, or D. I just wanted to take 30 seconds to address that and clarify, blah, 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 right? So not necessarily, of course, people are going to know, but you are not, as the facilitator, you are not calling out the individual, but you're addressing the situation and the comment that was made. Of course, when it comes to microaggressions, interruptions, those really blatant issues, those should be called out immediately in a respectful way, of course, but called out immediately because it could be someone is still learning and on their journey and doesn't recognize that they're doing it, may not even be on their journey and just doing it. The journey has to start somewhere, and it can start with that conversation. Hey, let's make sure that we remember to be respectful when someone uses the term A, B, C, or D. That's not respectful to the community, or the term in which it was used. Rather than use it this way, let's try to reframe it, rewire our brains, and use it a different way. And so disabled people, people with disabilities, right? So calling those out can be learning experiences. You never want to humiliate, disrespect someone because we don't know where they are in their journey. So making them teachable moments is important. Again, reading the room. If you find that you're on a roll and things are happening, make a note. The energy is moving forward, let's go with it, but come back to it one way or the other. If you feel that the time has run out, you can go meet with that individual one-on-one. But then I would also suggest an email, a message back to the group saying, hey, there was a situation where someone said someone did A, B, C, or D. I needed to sit with it for a little while on how I was going to approach it and address it. I have done it. Again, you're coming back to the group as a whole, because if you recognize something, someone else in the group did as well. And so you want to be able to acknowledge that I didn't just leave it hanging. I heard him say something and I didn't leave it hanging. I had a situation. So I co-host a series on race conversations, and someone in that community emailed me privately and said, hey, someone called me out on A, B, C, or D, and I didn't think it was appropriate. So my co-host and I took some time to think about it, and we connected with the person who initiated this private conversation, because we needed to address what was being said to the other individual. And then we went back to the person and said, hey, just want you to know that we addressed it. We had the conversation one-on-one. And that individual is open to another conversation if you'd like it. So really acknowledging, that's really an important part of it. Somehow, some way acknowledging, reading the room, understanding that this may or may not be the time for it. If you deem it's not the time for it, have that one-on-one, but then come back to the group and let them know that you completed that circle.
And Suman, there may be some folks here who would like to join the group that you mentioned. Yeah. What's the best way for them to do that?
Yes, I'm going to drop my email. Oh, my email address is in here. Shoot me an email and I will send you that link. It's a Zoom link. I also do post on my LinkedIn. So if you go to my profile, there's a post there from last week or the week before. Just go ahead and use that link. But otherwise, I will make sure to get that to you. I don't have it on hand. I should have thought about it, but I don't.
And just, I want to hit this real quick on our way out. There was a question around color blindness. If I've run into issues with color blindness, especially as a visual scribe, I understand that. So we use colors to differentiate notes and themes, but also find non-color ways to identify and refer to them. So for the scribes in the room, if you have any tips on color blindness, throw those in the chat. We can build a little repository. I did drop a link in the chat on color combinations to avoid red and green being a big one, that color combination. But absolutely, if you have strategies for color blindness as a scribe, go ahead and throw those in the chat. And Suman, of course, if you have any thoughts on that on our way out, actually, we'll go into overtime in a second and get any questions. Let me just wrap. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your questions, for your time. Please give us any feedback that you have. If you didn't get a chance to do the payment for this, again, that $12 just goes to help us continue to run these. Here's Brian's PayPal. You can throw the $12 over there. Otherwise, thank you so much. We'll go into overtime, get any lingering questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, everyone.